The Diablo IV open beta is here, and on Steam Deck it's a big surprise. I say this in a very good way. Look at the screen here, we're pushing over 60 frames per second and it's looking a lot better than it was in the early access beta. Just how much better you'll see in just a second. First of all, a couple of housekeeping items. You can now run this on Proton Experimental, which is what I was running here. No need to fiddle around with extra versions of Proton anymore. If you haven't installed the Battle.net launcher already, then I'll leave a link in the description below to how to get this installed. With Proton Experimental, you do still get the GPU warning, but just clicking OK will let you into the game, so don't let that deter you. One other thing though, as we've noticed in a few other items, for some reason the Battle.net launcher occasionally forgets that it's allowed to change the compatibility menu. Now I'm not sure whether this is a bug with Decky Loader or something else going on with the Steam Deck at the moment, but if this happens to you and you can't change the compatibility option, just go to your Steam Deck menu and hit the restart Steam option, let it restart, and you should then be able to go and change the compatibility option. Let us know in the comments below if you're getting this issue and if you're running Decky Loader or not. Okay, on to some of the big changes then. If I go over to the big town here of Kyovashad, you can correct me in the comments on how to say that. We do still get huge dips in the frames per second, but it's not stopping and jarring every few seconds. We just see that hit to the frames per second. Now this is kind of to be expected while they work out the optimization in the big towns, and although it does dip down into the 20s with the settings that I've got here, it is still playable, and at least we're not rubber banding anymore. The settings I was running for all this is a little bit different to the early access, as I was able for the most part to turn off FSR completely, keeping it on the low default settings, but also turning off the low FX toggle on the bottom as well. So things were looking a lot crisper. So although in towns we were getting the low frames per second, when we go into some of the dungeon areas, especially some of the instance dungeons, it did still hold fairly well. But when we had a ton of monsters with no FSR enabled, it did dip down into the 30s and 40s very briefly. Although we didn't get the huge load spikes that we did before, it is still dipping down on the frames per second. So if you are going to want to be pushing for that 60 frames per second mark, then we are going to have to bring in FSR just a little bit. Before we do that though, if we have a look at the performance and quality difference between early access and open beta, it really is stark. On the left we have the early access version and the open beta here on the right. You can see that we did get a bit better frames per second overall on the open beta, but the quality is just so much better, and we got rid of so much of those loading spikes. It's just so much smoother to play now in the open beta. So this is only a week apart, but already a huge difference. As you can see here, again keeping those settings as they were at the start, even in quite a hefty open world event, we're still holding 50 to 60 frames per second quite firmly, and it still looks absolutely fantastic. Unfortunately, when we go into some of the bigger dungeons, keeping that FSR off did dip down quite regularly into the 40 frames per second mark, and this was a little bit jarring while playing. So if we turn the Fidelity FX Super Resolution 2 mode to quality and cap the frame rate at 60 frames per second, and keep that VSync on in game as well, but keep it off on the Steam Deck, things get a lot smoother. Not only do they get smoother, but it holds that 60 frames per second a lot more closely. Although it does dip into the low 50s with lots of monsters, it's barely noticeable, and we don't have any loading spikes at all. So best settings for me is definitely the low preset, low FX mode off, FSR to quality mode, and capped at 60 frames per second with VSync on in-game, but not on deck. Let us know in the comments below which class you're going to be playing. We're going to be diving into the Necromancer more over this weekend, but I wanted to show the Sorcerer here so that you had a good comparison with the early access beta. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.